When my son Marcus drove off and left me stranded at Union Station with nothing but a $20 bill and a broken heart, he had no idea he'd just abandoned a woman worth $47 million. The rain was coming down hard that October evening, and as I watched his taillights disappear into the Chicago traffic, I made a decision that would change everything. What happened next will leave you speechless, but first, let me tell you exactly how we got here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Minnie Butler, I'm 73 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been living the most elaborate lie of my life. Not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because sometimes the people closest to you show their true colors only when they think you have nothing left to give. That rainy Thursday evening at Union Station wasn't just the night my son abandoned me. It was the night I finally understood what I'd been hiding from all these years. The day started like any other. I was in my small apartment on the South Side, the kind of place with thin walls and thinner bank accounts, or so Marcus believed. I'd been living there for 3 years, ever since I sold my house in Wicker Park and told him I was downsizing to save money. What I didn't tell him was that I'd used that house sale to quietly purchase a 15-unit apartment complex in Wicker Park, adding to the real estate portfolio I'd been building since 1995. Marcus had called me that morning, his voice tight with that familiar edge of impatience. "Mom, I need you to come with me to the lawyer's office today. We need to talk about your finances." There was something in his tone that made my stomach twist. The same feeling I'd had when he was 12, and I caught him stealing money from my purse. But this time, I wasn't dealing with a child taking lunch money. I was dealing with a 45-year-old man who thought his mother was a burden. I'd been supporting Marcus and his wife Linda for the past 2 years, ever since his consulting business went under. They lived in a beautiful townhouse in Oak Park, drove matching BMWs, and sent their daughter Sophie to private school. What they didn't know was that I wasn't stretching my Social Security to help them. I was using less than 1% of my actual income. The monthly checks I sent them, the emergency funds when their car broke down, the money for Sophie's violin lessons, all of it came from investment returns that regenerated faster than I could spend them. The lawyer's office was in the loop, and Marcus picked me up in his silver BMW, the one I'd supposedly helped him buy with my last savings. He was unusually quiet during the drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel like he was preparing for battle. Linda sat in the passenger seat, her blonde hair perfectly styled, scrolling through her phone with the kind of detached attention that said she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mom," Marcus said as we pulled into the parking garage, "I want you to know that Linda and I have been thinking about your situation, and we think it's time for some changes." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was silent except for the mechanical humming and Linda's nail tapping against her phone screen. I studied my son's profile, this man I'd raised alone after his father died in a construction accident when Marcus was just 8. I'd worked 3 jobs to put him through Northwestern, had gone without vacations and new clothes so he could have the best of everything. Now, at 73, I was about to discover what my sacrifice had truly meant to him. The lawyer's office was all glass and steel, with a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more per month than most people's rent. Richard Hartley was a thin man with silver hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He greeted us with professional warmth, but I could see the papers spread across his mahogany desk, and my name was on every single one of them. "Mrs. Butler," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Marcus and Linda have asked me to help facilitate a conversation about your financial planning and future care needs." I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. In my purse was a simple flip phone, the kind that made Marcus roll his eyes and suggest I needed help with technology. What he didn't know was that this phone had a direct line to my private wealth manager, and with one call, I could access more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. "Mom," Marcus began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard more frequently in recent months, "we're worried about you. Living in that neighborhood, struggling to make ends meet. Linda and I think it's time you considered assisted living." Linda looked up from her phone for the first time since we'd arrived. "We found a very nice facility in Naperville. It's clean, safe, and the staff is wonderful. You'd have your own room, meals provided, activities." I nodded slowly, as if I was considering it. "And how would this be paid for?" Richard Hartley cleared his throat and pushed a document across the desk. That's where this comes in. Marcus would become your financial power of attorney, which would allow him to manage your assets and make decisions about your care. It's really the most practical solution. I picked up the document and read it carefully, though I already knew what it said. My son wanted control of what he believed were my meager savings, my small Social Security check, and the few $1,000s he thought I had left. What he was actually asking for was the power to control a financial empire he couldn't even imagine. I see, I said quietly. And you think this is necessary? Marcus leaned forward, his face softening into the expression he'd used as a child when he wanted something. Mom, you're getting older. Last week you called me 3 times about the same doctor's appointment. You're forgetting things, having trouble managing your bills. We just want to help. The lie came so easily from his lips that I almost believed he'd convinced himself it was true. I hadn't called him 3 times about anything. I'd called once to confirm that Sophie's recital was on Saturday, and he'd been too busy to talk. The bills he was worried about were all automated payments from accounts he'd never seen, managed by a team of financial advisors who'd been handling my affairs for over a decade. What if I said no? I asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus and Linda exchanged a look, and I saw something pass between them that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a conversation. It was an intervention they'd planned, with papers already drawn up and a facility already chosen. Mom, Marcus said carefully, if you're not capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare, then we might have to pursue other options. Legal options. Richard Hartley shuffled uncomfortably in his chair. What Marcus means is that family members sometimes need to petition for guardianship when an elderly person becomes unable to care for themselves safely. I understood perfectly. My son was threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't voluntarily sign over control of my finances. He thought he was backing a helpless old woman into a corner, but what he was actually doing was showing me exactly who he'd become. I stood up slowly, my purse clutched in my hands. I need to think about this. There's nothing to think about, Linda said, her voice sharp for the first time. You're being stubborn, and it's not fair to Marcus. He's been supporting you for years, and now it's time for you to accept help. Supporting me. The words would have been laughable if they weren't so cruel. Every dollar Marcus had received from me he'd accepted as if it was his due. Every time I'd helped with their mortgage, their car payments, their credit card bills, he'd taken it as confirmation that I was draining my accounts for his benefit. Now he wanted to institutionalize me to get control of money he thought was almost gone. I'd like to go home now, I said. Marcus sighed heavily. Fine. But Mom, you can't keep living in denial. This is happening whether you like it or not. The papers will be filed on Monday. The ride back to my apartment was tense. Marcus kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, probably wondering if I was going to have some kind of breakdown. Linda had gone back to her phone, occasionally showing him something that made him nod or grunt in response. I sat in the back seat like a passenger in my own life, watching the city pass by and thinking about the 23 rental properties I owned, the stock portfolio that had grown beyond my wildest dreams, and the trust fund I'd been quietly building for Sophie's future. When we reached my building, Marcus didn't even turn off the engine. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. Maybe you'll be thinking more clearly then. I got out of the car and walked toward my building, listening to him drive away. But instead of going upstairs, I turned and walked the 3 blocks to the nearest coffee shop, where I sat in a corner booth and made a phone call that would change everything. Margaret, it's Minnie. I need you to prepare the full financial disclosure, everything. And I need you to have copies ready by Monday morning. Margaret Chen had been my wealth manager for 8 years, and her voice was calm and professional as always. Are you sure about this, Minnie? Once you reveal the extent of your assets, there's no going back to the way things were. I watched through the window as people hurried past in the autumn rain, all of them carrying their own secrets and burdens. I'm sure it's time. That evening, I sat in my modest apartment, surrounded by the carefully chosen props of my deception. The second-hand furniture, the discount store decorations, the bills I left strategically on the kitchen counter. All of it had been part of an elaborate test that Marcus had failed spectacularly. I'd wanted to see if my son would love me when he thought I had nothing left to give. Instead, I'd discovered that he saw me as an obstacle to overcome and a resource to control. My phone rang, and I saw Linda's name on the display. I almost didn't answer, but something made me curious about what she had to say when Marcus wasn't around. "Minnie," she said, her voice different now, softer but somehow more dangerous. "I wanted to call and talk to you, woman to woman. I know today was difficult, but you have to understand that we're doing this out of love." "Are you?" There was a pause. "Of course we are. Marcus has been so stressed about your situation. He barely sleeps, wondering if you're safe in that neighborhood, if you're eating properly, if you're taking your medications. This would be such a relief for all of us." I almost laughed. Marcus hadn't asked about my health in months, and the only medication I took was a daily vitamin. "And what about Sophie? How does she feel about her grandmother being put in a home?" "Sophie doesn't need to be burdened with adult problems. She's got her own life to worry about. School, friends, her music. She'll understand when she's older." There it was. My granddaughter, the one person in the family who still hugged me like she meant it, who called me every week just to chat, who sent me drawings and stories from school. She was being protected from the inconvenient truth of what was happening to me. "I see," I said. "And if I refuse to sign the papers?" Linda's voice hardened.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Then you'll force us to take steps none of us want to take. Minnie, you're not thinking clearly. Anyone can see that. Living in that apartment, refusing help, being so stubborn about everything. A judge would have no choice but to agree that you need protection from yourself." After she hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about the woman I'd once been. Minnie Butler had been a secretary at a law firm for 37 years, but she'd also been something else. A silent partner in one of the most successful real estate investment groups in the Midwest. When her husband died, she'd taken his life insurance money and, with the help of a brilliant financial advisor, had turned it into a fortune that grew exponentially year after year. She'd kept quiet about it, not out of shame, but out of wisdom. She'd seen what money did to families, how it changed relationships and created expectations. She'd wanted to know if the people she loved would love her for who she was, not what she could provide. For 15 years, she'd lived modestly, giving generously but never revealing the source of her generosity. Now, sitting in her carefully constructed modest apartment, Minnie Butler realized that her experiment had yielded results she'd never wanted to discover. Her son saw her as a burden, a problem to be solved, a resource to be managed. He was willing to lie to professionals, threaten legal action, and institutionalize her to get control of what he thought was a few $1,000s. The next morning, I called Marcus and told him I wanted to meet him for lunch. He suggested a diner near his office, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. It was exactly the kind of place he'd choose for his poor mother, somewhere cheap and forgettable. He was already there when I arrived, scrolling through his phone with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He looked up when I slid into the booth across from him, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never noticed before, a kind of calculation, like he was sizing up an opponent. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I told him. His face brightened slightly. "Good. I was hoping you'd come around. The facility really is nice, Mom. You'd have your own space, but there'd be people around to help if you needed anything. And you'd handle all my finances? Just the practical stuff. Bill paying, budgeting, making sure you have everything you need. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that anymore." I nodded slowly. "There's something I need to tell you first." Marcus leaned forward, and I could see him preparing to hear about some hidden debt or medical problem that would justify his actions. "What is it?" "I lied to you." He blinked. "About what?" "About everything. About the apartment, about my finances, about needing your help." I reached into my purse and pulled out a leather folder that contained financial statements I'd never shown anyone in my family. "I wanted to see if you'd love me when you thought I had nothing left." Marcus stared at the papers I'd placed on the table between us. The first page showed account balances that made his eyes widen, then narrow, then widen again. "What is this?" This is who I really am. Minnie Butler, real estate investor, with a net worth of $47 million. The apartment you think I'm struggling to afford? I own the building. The money I've been giving you and Linda? It's less than I make in interest every month. The color drained from his face. That's impossible. The assisted living facility you want to put me in costs $4,000 a month. I spend more than that on landscaping for my properties. I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like playing cards. These are the rental properties I own. This is my stock portfolio. This is the trust fund I've been building for Sophie's education. Marcus grabbed the papers, his hands shaking slightly as he read. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to know if you'd take care of me when you thought I was poor. I wanted to know if you'd love me when I couldn't give you anything more. I leaned back in the booth, studying his face. Yesterday I got my answer. Mom, He stopped, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that didn't exist. I was trying to help you. You were trying to control me. You were willing to have me declared incompetent, to take away my freedom, to put me in an institution, all so you could manage what you thought was my last few $1,000s. It wasn't about the money. I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was always about the money, Marcus. Every visit, every phone call, every time you acted like spending time with me was a burden you were shouldering out of duty. You saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person to be loved. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the financial statements spread across the table. So what happens now? Now you drive me to Union Station. What? I'm taking a trip, a long one, and I want you to be the one to take me there. Marcus looked confused, but he nodded. Okay, where are you going? That's not your concern anymore. The drive to Union Station was silent, except for the radio playing softly in the background. I watched the city pass by, thinking about the properties I owned, the investments I'd made, the careful plans I'd laid. In my purse was a first-class ticket to San Francisco, where I'd be spending the next 6 months in a penthouse apartment I'd bought 2 years ago but never used. When we reached the station, Marcus pulled up to the curb and turned to look at me. Mom, I know you're angry, but we can work this out. I made a mistake, but I'm still your son. I got out of the car and retrieved my single suitcase from the trunk. Then I walked to his window and handed him a $20 bill. For gas, I said. It's all I have left. He took the money, confusion clear on his face. What do you mean? I'm taking everything with me. The bank accounts, the properties, the investments. All of it. You wanted control of my finances, so I've made sure there's nothing left to control. You can't do that. I can. And I did. This morning I transferred everything into a new trust. You'll never see a penny of it. I leaned down so we were eye level. You abandoned me emotionally long ago. Now you'll understand what it feels like to be abandoned financially. Marcus got out of the car, his voice rising. Mom, you're being ridiculous. You can't just disappear. What about Sophie? What about your family? Sophie has my phone number. If she wants to reach me, she can. As for family, I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, holding his $20 bill like it was foreign currency. I learned yesterday that I don't have one. I turned and walked toward the station entrance, my suitcase rolling behind me. Marcus called my name, but I didn't turn around. It wasn't until I was inside the station, surrounded by the noise and bustle of travelers, that I realized how light I felt. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't pretending to be poor. I wasn't hiding my success or downplaying my accomplishments. I was simply Minnie Butler, a woman with the freedom to go anywhere and do anything. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was streaming through the station's tall windows. I bought a cup of coffee from a vendor and sat on one of the wooden benches, watching people hurry past with their own stories and destinations. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Mom, please don't do this. We can talk. I deleted the message without responding. There was nothing left to talk about. My son had shown me exactly who he was, and I'd finally stopped making excuses for him. The money I'd spent supporting him and Linda, The years I'd pretended to struggle while they lived comfortably, the elaborate deception I'd maintained to test their love, all of it was over. As my train was called, I stood up and walked toward the platform. I was 73 years old, worth $47 million, and for the first time in decades, I was accountable to no one but myself. The woman who'd been abandoned at this station no longer existed. In her place was someone who'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being needed. The train pulled away from Chicago as the sun was setting, and I settled into my first-class seat with a glass of wine and a view of the countryside rushing past. Tomorrow I'd wake up in San Francisco, in a penthouse apartment with a view of the bay. I'd have breakfast at a cafe I'd read about online, maybe visit a museum, or take a walk through Golden Gate Park. I'd do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, without considering how it would affect anyone else. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Linda. "Minnie, please call us." "Marcus is devastated. We had no idea about your money. We can work this out." I turned off the phone and dropped it into my purse. They'd had no idea about my money, but they'd had plenty of ideas about how to control what they thought I had. The difference was everything. As the train carried me toward my new life, I thought about the test I'd designed and the results I'd received. I'd learned that my son saw me as a burden, that my daughter-in-law saw me as an obstacle, and that both of them were willing to sacrifice my freedom for their convenience. But I'd also learned something else, that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I could walk away from people who didn't deserve me, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone's worst impulses. The train rocked gently as it gained speed, and I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new adventures, new chances to be the person I'd always been underneath the careful disguise of poverty I'd worn for so long. I was Minnie Butler, and I was finally free. The penthouse apartment in San Francisco exceeded every expectation I'd harbored during the cross-country train ride. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the bay, and the morning light streaming through them painted everything in shades of gold and amber that made the space feel like something from a dream. I'd purchased this property 18 months earlier through my investment company, intending it as a potential retirement retreat, but now it served as my sanctuary from a family that had revealed their true nature. Margaret Chan arrived at 10 in the morning, her briefcase containing the documents that would formalize what I'd begun at Union Station. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of precise energy that came from managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. We'd worked together for nearly a decade, and she'd never questioned my decision to live modestly while my wealth grew exponentially in carefully managed accounts. "The transfers are complete," she said, settling into one of the leather chairs overlooking the bay. "Every asset has been moved into the new trust structure. Your son and daughter-in-law no longer have any legal pathway to your finances, even if they were to successfully petition for guardianship in Illinois." I poured coffee from the French press I'd bought the day before, my first purchase as a woman who no longer had to pretend $20 was a significant expense. "What about the properties they're living in? The townhouse in Oak Park?" Margaret consulted her tablet. "The mortgage is in Marcus's name, but the down payment assistance you provided is documented as a gift, not a loan. Legally, you have no claim to recover it. However, the monthly payments you've been making can be stopped immediately. Stop them. Consider it done. I should mention that your phone has been ringing constantly since yesterday evening. I took the liberty of having calls forwarded to my office so you wouldn't be disturbed." I nodded, grateful for her foresight. "What are they saying?" "Initially, anger and demands that you return home immediately, then confusion about the bank accounts." This morning, the tone shifted to what I'd characterize as panic. Marcus discovered that his automatic mortgage payment was declined, and Linda called 17 times asking about the college fund they thought you were maintaining for Sophie. The coffee was excellent, rich and smooth, in a way that reminded me I no longer had to buy the discount brand from the grocery store clearance rack. There never was a college fund in their names. I've been building one directly for Sophie, but they won't have access to it until she turns 25. A wise decision. Children who inherit too young often make poor choices. Margaret paused, studying my face. "Minnie, I have to ask, are you certain about the completeness of this separation?" Once Marcus and Linda realize the full extent of what's happened, they may take more aggressive action. I thought about the question while watching a ferry cross the bay below. 2 days ago, I'd been a woman who counted coupons and worried about whether buying name-brand detergent was too extravagant. Today, I was drinking coffee that cost more per pound than my former monthly grocery budget, in an apartment worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt overdue. They made their choice when they decided I was incompetent and disposable, I said. I'm simply accepting their assessment and removing myself from their lives. Margaret nodded. In that case, there are some practical matters we should discuss. Your Chicago apartment lease expires at the end of next month. Your furniture and personal belongings are still there. Do you want me to arrange for storage or shipping? Ship the photo albums and my mother's jewelry. Donate everything else. I paused, thinking about the careful props I'd used to maintain my deception. Actually, there's a women's shelter on the south side that could use the furniture. Have it delivered there. Of course. What about mail forwarding? Set up a post office box. I don't want anyone knowing this address. Margaret made notes on her tablet, then looked up with the expression she wore when discussing particularly sensitive matters. There's something else. This morning, Marcus contacted a private investigator. He's trying to locate assets he believes you might be hiding. The irony was almost amusing. Let him search. He won't find anything connected to my former address or former life. Everything is held through the trust now, with layers of legal protection he can't penetrate. He also called Richard Hartley, the attorney from yesterday's meeting. Apparently, he's considering filing a missing persons report, claiming you're not mentally competent to make decisions about your own welfare. This was more serious than I'd anticipated, but not unexpected. Marcus had committed to a narrative where I was a confused old woman who needed protection from herself. The alternative, accepting that he'd misjudged me completely, would require an admission of error he wasn't psychologically capable of making. What would happen if he files such a report? Very little initially. You're an adult who left voluntarily, and you have the financial means to care for yourself. However, if he can convince a judge that you're mentally impaired, there could be complications. That's why I'd recommend we take some preemptive steps. Margaret outlined a plan that involved having me evaluated by a psychiatrist, documenting my mental competence in a way that would be legally unassailable. She also suggested I hire a security consultant to ensure my privacy was protected, given that Marcus now had strong financial motivations to locate me. How much would all this cost? The question was automatic, a reflex from decades of careful budgeting. Margaret smiled. Minnie, your investment portfolio generated more income yesterday than most people make in a year. Cost is no longer a constraint for you. The adjustment would take time. Living frugally for so long had created mental habits that didn't disappear overnight, but there was something liberating about the reminder that I no longer had to consider every expense carefully, no longer had to choose between paying for things I needed and things I wanted. After Margaret left, I spent the afternoon exploring the neighborhood around my building. North Beach had a European feel, with narrow streets, sidewalk cafes, and the kind of small shops that sold interesting things rather than practical necessities. I bought fresh flowers for the apartment, artisanal bread from a bakery that smelled like heaven, and a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. At a bookstore tucked between a gallery and a vintage clothing shop, I purchased 3 novels I'd wanted to read but never allowed myself time for. The woman behind the counter was about Sophie's age, with purple streaks in her hair and the kind of genuine smile that suggested she loved what she did for a living. These are great choices, she said, ringing up my purchases. Are you visiting San Francisco or do you live here? I just moved here, I said, and the words felt strange and wonderful in my mouth. From where? Chicago. Big change. What brought you west? I considered the question. I decided it was time to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. She handed me the bag with my books, her expression thoughtful. That's brave. Most people spend their whole lives wearing masks. Walking home, I thought about masks and pretense, and the elaborate performance I'd maintained for 15 years. The truth was, I'd become so accustomed to playing the role of struggling widow that I'd almost forgotten who I was underneath. The woman who'd built a fortune through careful investing and shrewd business decisions had been buried beneath the character who clipped coupons and worried about utility bills. That evening, I called Sophie. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual for a 17-year-old, but when I tried again an hour later with the same result, I began to suspect interference. Linda had probably confiscated Sophie's phone to prevent her from contacting me, another control tactic in a family that specialized in manipulation. Instead, I sent a letter to Sophie's school, marked for her personal attention. In it, I included my new phone number and address, along with a brief explanation that I'd moved to California for my health and wanted to maintain contact with my granddaughter. I didn't mention the conflict with her parents, but I made it clear that she was welcome to visit anytime she wanted. The next morning brought a phone call from an unexpected source. Detective Raymond Walsh from the Chicago Police Department was calling about a missing persons report filed by my son. His voice was professionally neutral, but I could hear the skepticism underneath. "Mrs. Butler, your son is concerned about your welfare. He states that you left home suddenly without explanation and may not be competent to care for yourself." Detective Walsh, I'm 73 years old, not 93. I left because I chose to leave, and I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself. Are you safe where you are? Very safe. And you left voluntarily? Completely voluntarily. There was a pause. Mrs. Butler, can I ask why your son believes you're incompetent? The question revealed more than Detective Walsh probably intended. Missing persons reports for elderly adults were common, but they usually involved genuine concern rather than potential financial motivation. The fact that he was asking about competence suggested he'd sensed something off about Marcus's story. You'd have to ask him that, I said. But I can tell you that yesterday I was evaluated by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychiatrist here in San Francisco, and she found me to be completely competent and mentally sound. I can provide you with her contact information if necessary. That won't be needed at this time. I'll file a report indicating that you've been contacted and are safe. Your son may not be satisfied with that answer. My son's satisfaction is no longer my responsibility. After hanging up, I realized that Margaret had been right about the need for protective measures. Marcus wasn't going to accept my disappearance quietly, and his next moves would likely be more aggressive. The private investigator was probably just the beginning. I spent the rest of the week establishing routines in my new life. Morning coffee on the balcony, reading the newspaper without worrying about the cost of delivery. Afternoon walks through different neighborhoods, learning the rhythm of a city that felt alive in ways Chicago never had. Evening phone calls with Margaret, reviewing investment reports and discussing opportunities I'd never allowed myself to consider. The money felt abstract at first, numbers on statements rather than tangible reality. But gradually it began to translate into freedom. Freedom to eat at restaurants without calculating the tip carefully. Freedom to replace clothing when it wore out rather than mending it indefinitely. Freedom to donate generously to causes I cared about without wondering if I could afford it. More importantly, it was freedom from the constant performance of poverty I'd maintained for so long. No more checking prices twice before putting items in my shopping cart. No more declining invitations because I couldn't afford to participate. No more accepting less than I deserved because I was supposedly in no position to demand better. Margaret called on Friday with an update that confirmed my suspicions about Marcus's escalating behavior. The private investigator has been making inquiries about your background, trying to locate hidden assets or family members who might know where you are. He's also been asking questions about your mental health, trying to build a case for incompetence. Has he found anything useful? Nothing. Your financial privacy was well protected even before we moved everything into the trust. But Minnie, there's something else. Marcus has been calling your former neighbors, your doctor, even the grocery store where you shopped. He's telling people you're missing and may be in danger. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Marcus was creating a narrative where he was the concerned son trying to protect his vulnerable mother, rather than the man who'd tried to institutionalize me for financial gain. He was counting on people's natural sympathy for elderly women and their assumption that family members always had good intentions. What kind of questions is he asking? Mostly about your behavior in recent months. Whether you seemed confused, forgetful, or unable to manage your affairs. He's building a case for diminished capacity. And what are people telling him? That you are sharp, independent, and perfectly capable of managing your own life. Mrs. Peterson from the apartment across the hall told him he should be ashamed of himself for letting you live in such a rough neighborhood if he was really concerned about your welfare. I laughed, remembering Mrs. Peterson's frank manner and unwillingness to tolerate nonsense from anyone. Good for her. The grocery store manager said you always knew exactly what you wanted and never seemed confused about prices or payments. Your former doctor's office wouldn't release information without your written consent, which frustrated the investigator considerably. The investigation was backfiring, but I knew Marcus wouldn't give up easily. Men like him doubled down when challenged, convinced that persistence would eventually validate their original position. He'd probably already moved on to more aggressive tactics. Margaret, I want you to hire that security consultant we discussed. And I want to explore legal options for preventing further harassment. Already arranged. David Kim will be here Monday morning to assess your situation and recommend protective measures. As for legal action, we have several options, ranging from cease and desist letters to restraining orders. That weekend, I allowed myself to imagine what life might be like without the constant undercurrent of family obligation and disappointment. I visited art museums, walked along the waterfront, and had dinner at restaurants where the servers didn't rush me through my meal. I bought a membership to the San Francisco Symphony and season tickets to a theater company Margaret had recommended. For the first time in 15 years, I was making plans based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford or what others expected of me. The feeling was intoxicating and slightly terrifying, like learning to fly after spending a lifetime convinced I was meant to walk. Sunday evening brought a call from Sophie, finally able to reach me after retrieving her confiscated phone from her mother's bedroom. Her voice was small and confused, the way it had been when she was younger and couldn't understand why adults made things so complicated. Grandma Minnie? Dad says you disappeared and might be sick. He says you're not thinking clearly and could be in danger. Sophie, sweetheart, I'm perfectly fine. I moved to California because I needed a change, and I'm very happy here. But why didn't you tell us you were leaving? Dad says you just vanished without saying goodbye. The manipulation had reached even her, filtered through her parents' need to control the narrative. Sophie deserved the truth, but in age-appropriate terms that wouldn't force her to choose sides in an adult conflict. Sometimes adults need space to figure things out, I said carefully. Your dad and I had some disagreements about my future, and I decided it was best for me to start fresh somewhere new. Are you ever coming back? The question pierced my heart. I don't know, sweetheart, but I want you to know that you can always call me, and if you ever want to visit California, you're more than welcome. Mom says you don't have enough money to take care of yourself anymore. She says that's why Dad was trying to help you. There it was, the story they'd constructed to justify their actions. I was the confused old woman who didn't understand her own limitations, and they were the responsible adults trying to save me from myself. Sophie, I promise you that I have everything I need to take care of myself. I'm living in a beautiful apartment with a view of the ocean, and I'm healthier and happier than I've been in years. Really? Really. In fact, I've started taking art classes and learning to paint. Maybe next time we talk, I can tell you about the watercolor I'm working on. We chatted for another 10 minutes about her school, her music lessons, and the college applications she'd be starting soon. Sophie had inherited my practical nature and her grandfather's artistic sensibilities, and I could hear both in the way she talked about her future plans. She wanted to study architecture, to design buildings that made people feel hopeful and inspired. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching the lights come on across the bay, thinking about the trust fund I'd been building for Sophie's education. She'd graduate from whatever university she chose without debt, and she'd have enough additional support to pursue internships and travel opportunities that would broaden her perspective on the world. More importantly, she'd inherit something Marcus would never have: the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally, not for what she could provide or how she could be useful, but simply for who she was. The next morning brought David Kim, the security consultant Margaret had recommended. He was a former FBI agent with the kind of quiet competence that inspired confidence, and his assessment of my situation was both thorough and sobering. Your son's behavior suggests he's moved beyond normal family concern into something more problematic, he said after reviewing the reports from the private investigator and the pattern of calls to my former associates. The fact that he's trying to build a case for mental incompetence while simultaneously searching for hidden assets indicates a level of financial motivation that could lead to escalated harassment. What kind of escalation? Attempts to have you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. Legal challenges to any financial transactions you make. Possibly even allegations of elder abuse if he can convince authorities that someone is manipulating you. The strategies were designed to undermine my autonomy and credibility, painting me as a victim who needed rescue rather than a woman who'd made independent choices about her own life. How do we prevent that? David outlined a comprehensive protection plan that included regular documentation of my mental competence, legal barriers to involuntary commitment, and monitoring systems to detect if Marcus or his investigator attempted to locate me physically. The measures seemed excessive until he explained the psychology of family financial disputes. Men like your son often have a sense of entitlement to family wealth, especially when they've been receiving financial support. The discovery that there's significantly more money than they knew about, combined with their sudden loss of access, can trigger behavior that ranges from desperate to dangerous. Dangerous how? At minimum, continued harassment and legal challenges. At worst, attempts at physical confrontation or kidnapping, justified in their minds as rescuing you from your own poor judgment. The word kidnapping seemed melodramatic until David showed me case studies of similar situations. Adult children who'd had elderly parents declared incompetent and institutionalized against their will. Families who'd used legal guardianship to steal millions from relatives they portrayed as victims of financial abuse. The key is establishing and maintaining clear documentation that you're acting independently and competently, David explained. Regular medical and psychiatric evaluations, video recordings of your daily activities, witness statements from people who interact with you regularly. It felt like preparing for a war I'd never wanted to fight. But the alternative was allowing Marcus to construct a narrative that portrayed me as a helpless victim, rather than a woman who'd finally stopped enabling her son's worst impulses. That afternoon, I had my first art lesson at a studio in the Mission District. A bright space filled with canvases, and the kind of creative energy I'd forgotten existed. The instructor was a woman named Rosa who looked at my tentative first brushstrokes and nodded encouragingly. "Don't think so much," she said. "Trust your instincts." It was advice that applied to more than painting. For too many years, I'd second-guessed my instincts about Marcus, making excuses for behavior that hurt me, and enabling patterns that were unhealthy for both of us. I'd trusted his version of reality over my own observations, his needs over my own well-being. Now, mixing colors on a palette and trying to capture the way afternoon light fell across the studio floor, I was learning to trust myself again. The painting was imperfect, but it was mine, created without concern for anyone else's approval or judgment. When I returned home that evening, there was a message from Margaret waiting on my voicemail. Marcus had escalated again, this time contacting the Illinois Department of Aging with concerns about elder abuse. He was claiming that someone was isolating me from my family and controlling my finances for their own benefit. The irony was staggering. The son who'd tried to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized was now claiming I was the victim of the very behavior he'd planned to perpetrate himself. But I was no longer the woman who'd sat in a lawyer's office, listening to plans made without her input for a life she didn't want. I was no longer the woman who'd accepted being treated as a burden or an obstacle to be managed. I was Minnie Butler, and I was worth $47 million, and I was finally, completely, triumphantly free. The investigation by the Illinois Department of Aging turned out to be more thorough than Marcus had probably anticipated. Within a week of his complaint, I received a call from Sandra Martinez, a caseworker who specialized in elder abuse cases. Her tone was professional but warm, and I could tell she'd dealt with enough false reports to recognize the warning signs. "Mrs. Butler, we received a complaint alleging that you may be the victim of financial exploitation and isolation. I'm required to conduct a welfare check to ensure your safety and well-being." "I understand completely. What would you need from me?" Ideally, a video call where I can see you and your living environment, along with documentation of your financial independence and mental competence. Your son claimed you were taken from Chicago against your will and are being held somewhere against your wishes. The video call took place the following morning, with Margaret present as my legal representative and Dr. Martinez participating by phone to verify my recent psychiatric evaluation. Sandra could see my penthouse apartment, watch me move around freely, and observe my clear, coherent responses to her questions about my situation. Mrs. Butler, your son provided us with a description of someone who appeared confused and financially vulnerable. That doesn't match what I'm seeing today. Miss Martinez, my son was confused about my financial situation, but that confusion was intentional on my part. I wanted to see how my family would treat me if they believed I had nothing left to give. Sandra's expression grew more serious. And what did you discover? That they were willing to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized in order to gain control of what they thought were my last few $1,000s. I showed her the documents from the lawyers' meeting, the power of attorney papers Marcus had wanted me to sign, and the research I discovered about the assisted living facility he'd chosen. Sandra reviewed everything carefully, taking notes and asking pointed questions about the timeline of events. Mrs. Butler, based on what I'm seeing and hearing, this appears to be a case of attempted financial exploitation rather than actual exploitation. Your son seems to have been planning to gain control of your assets under false pretenses. That's my understanding as well. I'll be closing this case as unfounded, and I'll be noting in my report that the complaint appears to have been filed in bad faith. I should warn you that this may not be the end of your son's attempts to intervene, but you've done an excellent job of documenting your competence and independence. After the call ended, Margaret and I discussed the implications of Sandra's findings. Having an official determination that Marcus's complaint was unfounded would provide additional protection against future allegations. But it would also likely escalate his desperation. Men like Marcus don't accept defeat gracefully, Margaret warned. When legal channels fail, they often resort to more direct approaches. Meaning what? Meaning he might try to find you physically. David Kim's security recommendations are looking more necessary by the day. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a psychiatrist David had recommended for ongoing competency documentation. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the sort of practical wisdom that came from decades of working with people in crisis. Mrs. Butler, I understand you're dealing with family members who question your mental capacity. This is unfortunately more common than most people realize, especially when significant money is involved. We spent 2 hours together, during which she conducted a comprehensive mental status examination and reviewed my medical history. Her questions were thorough but not intrusive, and I found myself talking about things I hadn't discussed with anyone. The loneliness of pretending to be poor, the hurt of discovering my son's true feelings about me, the liberation of finally living authentically. You've been through a significant trauma, Dr. Rodriguez said when we finished. The betrayal by adult children is one of the most psychologically damaging experiences an elderly person can face. The fact that you've responded by protecting yourself, rather than trying to repair the relationship, shows remarkable emotional intelligence. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too harsh. He's still my son. Mrs. Butler, love doesn't require you to enable harmful behavior. Your son attempted to steal your autonomy and your financial security. Those aren't the actions of someone who deserves unlimited forgiveness. Her words carried the weight of professional experience and personal understanding. I left her office with a formal evaluation documenting my complete mental competence and a recommendation for periodic follow-up assessments to maintain that documentation. The next few weeks settled into a routine that felt increasingly natural. Morning coffee on the balcony while reading the financial news, something I'd never allowed myself time for when I was pretending to struggle with basic expenses. Afternoon activities that ranged from art classes to volunteer work at a literacy center in the Mission District. Evening calls with Margaret to review investment opportunities and philanthropic possibilities. The volunteer work surprised me with its satisfaction. Teaching adults to read required patience and creativity, skills I'd developed during Marcus's childhood but hadn't used in years. My students were mostly immigrants and formerly incarcerated individuals, people who'd been written off by society but were determined to improve their lives. Maria Santos was a woman my age, who'd come from El Salvador 30 years earlier, but had never learned to read English well enough to pass her citizenship test. Working with her twice a week, I watched her determination overcome decades of linguistic barriers. When she finally passed the test and became a citizen, her tears of joy reminded me that transformation was possible at any age. "Señora Minnie," she said after the ceremony, "you gave me the gift of reading. How can I ever thank you?" "You don't need to thank me, Maria. You did the work. But you believed I could do it when I didn't believe in myself." The conversation stayed with me as I walked home through the bustling streets of the mission. For 15 years, I'd hidden my capabilities and downplayed my achievements to test my family's love. But here, working with people who had every reason to give up hope, I was rediscovering the satisfaction of using my abilities to help others succeed. That evening brought a call from Sophie that shifted the tone of everything. Her voice was shaky and I could hear tears just beneath the surface. "Grandma Minnie, something's wrong with Dad. He's been acting really strange lately, and Mom's scared." "What kind of strange, sweetheart?" "He stays up all night making phone calls and sending emails. He's obsessed with finding you. Yesterday, he drove to the airport because he thought he saw you getting on a plane. Mom says he's spending all their money hiring investigators and lawyers." The image of Marcus haunting airports and chasing shadows would have been comical if it weren't so destructive to his family. His obsession with finding me was destroying his relationship with Linda and frightening his daughter. "Sophie, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your father is angry because he discovered that I'm not the poor old woman he thought I was. He's having trouble accepting that he was wrong about me. But why won't you just come home and talk to him? Because talking won't fix what's broken between us. Your father tried to have me put in a nursing home so he could control my money. That's not something I can forgive or forget." There was silence on the line, and I could almost hear Sophie processing this information, trying to reconcile the father she knew with the actions I was describing. "Is that really what happened?" "Yes, sweetheart. I have documents proving everything. Your father thought I was nearly broke, and instead of helping me, he decided I was a burden who needed to be managed." "I don't understand." "Dad always said he was helping support you." The lie had been so complete that even Sophie believed it. Marcus had positioned himself as the dutiful son sacrificing for his elderly mother, when the reality was exactly the opposite. "Sophie, I was never poor. I've been wealthy for many years, but I hid it because I wanted to see if your parents would love me when they thought I had nothing left to give. And they didn't. No, they didn't." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sophie asking questions that revealed how thoroughly her parents had misrepresented the situation. She'd been told I was confused and possibly suffering from dementia. She'd been told that mysterious people were taking advantage of me financially. She'd been told that my disappearance was evidence of my inability to make rational decisions. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you really happy where you are now?" "Happier than I've been in years." "Good." "Because I was worried you were sad and alone somewhere." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching the evening fog roll in from the Pacific, thinking about the different kinds of damage Marcus's obsession was causing. He wasn't just harassing me, he was destroying his own family's peace and security, spending money they couldn't afford on a quest that had no possible positive outcome. Margaret called the next morning with news that confirmed Sophie's observations. Marcus has hired a second private investigator, this one specializing in missing persons cases. He's also retained a law firm in California, apparently trying to find legal grounds to challenge your residency here. On what basis? They're arguing that you fled the state to avoid competency proceedings, and that California authorities should cooperate with Illinois in returning you for evaluation. The legal theory was nonsense, but it represented a significant escalation in Marcus's campaign against me. He was no longer just trying to find me. He was trying to create a legal framework for forcing me to return to Illinois against my will. How much is all this costing him? Margaret's pause was telling. Based on the firms he's hired and the scope of their activities, I'd estimate he's spending $15,000 to $20,000 a month. The number was staggering, especially for someone who'd been receiving financial assistance from me just months earlier. Marcus was bankrupting his family to pursue a vendetta against the woman who'd been supporting them. Margaret, I want you to document everything. Every investigator he hires, every legal motion he files, every dollar he spends on this obsession. I want a complete record of his behavior. May I ask why? Because eventually this is going to escalate to the point where legal intervention becomes necessary. When that happens, I want to be able to show a pattern of harassment and financial irresponsibility that demonstrates why he should never have access to anyone's money, including his own. That afternoon, David Kim called with an update that confirmed my worst suspicions. The second investigator Marcus hired has been making inquiries about your building's security protocols. He's also been asking questions about your daily routines, where you shop, when you leave the apartment, whether you travel alone. That sounds like surveillance preparation. That's exactly what it sounds like. Mrs. Butler, I think it's time we considered more active security measures. David's recommendations included a personal security detail for high-risk periods, additional apartment security, and a monitoring system that would alert authorities if Marcus or his investigators came within a certain distance of my location. This seems excessive for a family dispute, I said. Mrs. Butler, this stopped being a family dispute when your son hired multiple investigators to track your movements and lawyers to challenge your right to live where you choose. This is now a stalking situation with significant financial motivations. The conversation forced me to confront the reality that Marcus's behavior had moved beyond normal disappointment or even greed into something genuinely threatening. He wasn't just trying to control my money, he was trying to control my entire existence. That evening, I called Dr. Rodriguez to discuss the psychological implications of what was happening. Her assessment was both professional and deeply concerning. Mrs. Butler, your son appears to be experiencing what we call a narcissistic collapse. His identity was built around being the responsible son caring for his dependent mother. When that narrative crumbled, he couldn't adjust to the new reality. So he's trying to force the old reality back into existence. Exactly. In his mind, if he can prove you're incompetent and bring you back under his control, he can restore the dynamic that made him feel important and needed. What happens if he can't? That's when these situations become most dangerous. People experiencing narcissistic collapse often escalate to increasingly desperate behaviors because the alternative, accepting that they were wrong, is psychologically impossible for them. Dr. Rodriguez recommended that I limit all contact with Marcus and Linda, document any attempts at communication, and be prepared for the possibility that direct confrontation might become unavoidable. The good news is that you have resources and support systems he doesn't know about. The bad news is that his behavior suggests he's willing to take significant risks to achieve his goals. The next morning brought proof of Dr. Rodriguez's concerns. I woke to find my doorman, Carlos, looking unusually tense as I came down for my morning walk. Mrs. Butler, there was a man here very early this morning asking questions about you. He claimed to be your nephew, said the family was worried because they hadn't heard from you. What did you tell him? Nothing. But he was very persistent, and he knew details about you that seemed personal. He knew you were from Chicago, knew you had a son named Marcus. The investigator had found me, despite all the precautions we'd taken. The knowledge that someone had been outside my building, asking questions about my habits and routines, made the abstract threat feel suddenly immediate and personal. I called David immediately, and he arrived within an hour with a security specialist who conducted a comprehensive review of the building's vulnerabilities. Their assessment was sobering. The investigator had learned enough about my routines to plan effective surveillance or intervention. We need to assume your location is compromised, David said. The question is whether you want to relocate or implement stronger security measures here. The decision felt like choosing between running and fighting, between allowing Marcus to drive me away from a life I'd just begun to build, and standing my ground against his escalating campaign of harassment. I'm not running anymore, I said. Implement whatever security is necessary. The security upgrades began immediately. Additional cameras, improved access controls, a panic button system that would summon immediate help, and most importantly, a personal protection specialist who would accompany me during high-risk activities. James Morrison was a former Secret Service agent in his 50s, with the kind of calm competence that made his presence reassuring rather than alarming. He dressed like a businessman, drove an unremarkable sedan, and blended into crowds so effectively that most people never noticed him. Mrs. Butler, my job is to keep you safe while allowing you to live normally. The goal is to deter problems before they develop, not to restrict your activities. What kind of problems are you expecting? Based on your son's behavior pattern, most likely an attempted confrontation in a public place where he thinks you'll be more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. He'll probably bring family members as leverage. His wife, possibly your granddaughter. The strategy was emotionally sophisticated and deeply manipulative. Marcus would arrange a, quote, chance encounter in a place where making a scene would be embarrassing, then use family loyalty and social pressure to force me into a conversation I didn't want to have. How do we prevent that? By varying your routines, staying aware of your surroundings, and being prepared to leave immediately if he appears. The key is not giving him the opportunity to control the narrative or the setting. That weekend, James's predictions proved accurate. I was at the farmer's market in the Ferry Building, selecting vegetables for the week, when I noticed a familiar figure near the flower stands. Linda was there, looking around nervously, clearly searching for someone. I touched James's arm and nodded toward her. He immediately began guiding me toward a different exit, but Linda spotted us before we could leave unnoticed. Minnie, wait! Her voice carried across the market, causing heads to turn. Please, we need to talk. James kept me moving, but Linda followed, her voice growing more desperate. Minnie, Marcus is sick. He's obsessed with finding you, and it's destroying our family. Sophie misses you terribly. The emotional manipulation was exactly what James had predicted, designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself and responsible for Marcus's self-destructive behavior. I felt the familiar pull of family obligation, the instinct to fix problems that weren't mine to solve. But I also felt something else, a clear understanding that Linda's presence here wasn't coincidence. She'd been stationed at the market, probably one of several locations Marcus was monitoring, waiting for me to appear. Keep walking, James murmured. Don't engage. We reached the parking garage without further incident, but the encounter left me shaken. Seeing Linda's desperation had been painful, but it had also confirmed that Marcus's obsession was indeed destroying his family relationships. He's using his wife as bait, James observed as we drove home. That suggests he's running out of other options. What comes next? Probably a direct approach. If he can't manipulate you through guilt or family pressure, he'll try confrontation or legal action. That evening, Margaret called with news that confirmed James's assessment. Marcus has filed a petition in California court requesting a welfare check and possible involuntary psychiatric hold. He's claiming you're being held against your will by people who are exploiting you financially. Can he do that? He can file the petition, but it won't go anywhere. We have extensive documentation of your mental competence and voluntary relocation. However, it does mean he's willing to use the legal system as a harassment tool. The pattern was clear. Marcus had tried private investigators, hired lawyers, sent his wife to ambush me at the farmer's market, and now was attempting to use California's mental health system to force a confrontation. Each failure only escalated his desperation and his willingness to take extreme measures. Margaret, I want to file for a restraining order against Marcus, Linda, and anyone acting on their behalf. That's probably wise. David Kim has been documenting everything, so we have plenty of evidence to support the request. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I would finally have the opportunity to present my side of the story to a judge and establish legal boundaries around Marcus's behavior. But I also knew that legal documents wouldn't change the fundamental problem. My son had constructed an identity around being needed by his dependent mother, and he couldn't accept that the woman he'd planned to institutionalize was actually more financially successful than he would ever be. The confrontation that was coming wouldn't just be about money or legal rights. It would be about two completely different versions of reality, and only one of them could survive intact. As I prepared for the hearing, gathering documents and witness statements and expert evaluations, I realized that this fight wasn't really about me anymore. It was about establishing a precedent for how elderly people should be treated by adult children who see them as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected. I was no longer just Minnie Butler, the woman who'd been abandoned at Union Station. I was Minnie Butler, the woman who'd fought back and won, and I was going to make sure my victory counted for something larger than my own freedom. The restraining order hearing took place in a downtown San Francisco courthouse on a crisp Thursday morning in November. I arrived with Margaret, Dr. Rodriguez, and a folder containing every piece of evidence we'd accumulated over the past 2 months. James Morrison waited outside, ready to escort me home after what promised to be an emotionally challenging proceeding. Judge Patricia Walton was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every possible excuse and manipulation in her years on the bench. She reviewed our petition carefully before calling the hearing to order. "Mrs. Butler, you're requesting a restraining order against your son, Marcus Butler, your daughter-in-law, Linda Butler, and any agents acting on their behalf. Please explain the circumstances that led to this request." I took a deep breath and began with the lawyers' meeting in Chicago, the attempted power of attorney, and Marcus's plan to have me institutionalized. Judge Walton listened without interruption as I described the escalating harassment, the private investigators, the false reports to government agencies, and the attempted ambush at the farmers market. "Your Honor, my son believes he's entitled to control my finances and my life choices because he assumed I was poor and helpless. When he discovered that I'm actually quite wealthy and capable of caring for myself, he couldn't accept that his assumptions were wrong." Margaret presented the documentation: financial records proving my competence, psychiatric evaluations confirming my mental capacity, reports from the Illinois Department of Aging dismissing Marcus's allegations, and David Kim's security assessments detailing the surveillance attempts. "This isn't a family disagreement," Margaret argued. "This is systematic harassment, motivated by financial gain, and an inability to accept that Mrs. Butler has the right to make her own life choices." Judge Walton examined each document carefully, asking pointed questions about the timeline of events and the nature of Marcus's behavior. When she reached the reports from the private investigators, her expression grew increasingly serious. "Mrs. Butler, your son has spent considerable resources attempting to locate and monitor you. In your opinion, what is his ultimate goal? To force me back to Illinois so he can have me declared incompetent and gain control of my assets. He's already prepared the legal paperwork and chosen an assisted living facility. He just needs to get me back within his jurisdiction. And you believe this represents a threat to your safety? Your Honor, a man who's willing to have his own mother institutionalized against her will for financial gain is capable of anything. I don't feel safe as long as he has access to my location and daily routines." The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours, with Judge Walton asking detailed questions about my financial capacity, mental competence, and the voluntary nature of my relocation to California. By the end, it was clear that she'd formed a strong opinion about the merits of our request. "Mr. Butler," she said, addressing the empty defendant's table where Marcus should have been sitting if he'd chosen to contest the restraining order, "has engaged in a pattern of behavior that constitutes harassment and stalking under California law. His actions appear to be motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine concern for his mother's welfare." The restraining order was granted immediately, with provisions that prohibited Marcus, Linda, or anyone acting on their behalf from contacting me directly, coming within 500 feet of my residence, or hiring investigators to monitor my activities. Violation would result in immediate arrest and prosecution. "Mrs. Butler," Judge Walton said as she signed the order, "I want you to know that this court takes elder abuse very seriously, including attempted financial exploitation by family members. You've done exactly the right thing by protecting yourself." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The legal victory was important, but it couldn't erase the fundamental reality that my relationship with my son was permanently damaged. The restraining order would protect me from further harassment, but it wouldn't restore the family connection I'd lost. Margaret was optimistic about the order's effectiveness. "Marcus strikes me as someone who respects authority when it's clearly established. A court order with criminal penalties should be enough to deter further contact attempts." But I wasn't as confident. Men who spend $20,000 a month on private investigators and frivolous lawsuits weren't easily deterred by legal documents. Marcus had invested too much in his campaign against me to simply walk away because a judge told him to stop. My instincts proved correct 3 days later when David Kim called with disturbing news. Marcus has hired a law firm in Nevada. They're apparently exploring legal strategies that would circumvent the California restraining order. How would that work? If they could establish grounds for a federal case, they might be able to argue that the restraining order interferes with interstate commerce or constitutional rights. It's a stretch legally, but it shows he's not giving up. The Nevada lawyers represented a new level of escalation, suggesting that Marcus was willing to spend unlimited resources on his obsession with controlling me, but it also represented an opportunity I hadn't previously considered. David, I want you to document every dollar Marcus spends on this campaign. Legal fees, investigator costs, travel expenses, everything. I want a complete financial picture of his harassment activities. What are you planning? I'm going to make sure there are consequences for his behavior that go beyond restraining orders. That evening, I called Sophie for what I suspected might be our last conversation for a while. Her voice was strained, and I could hear the toll her father's obsession was taking on her mental health. Grandma Minnie, Dad's been calling lawyers all day. He says the California judge was wrong, and he's going to get the decision overturned. Sophie, I need you to understand something important. Your father isn't trying to help me. He's trying to control me. There's a big difference. But why would he want to control you if he doesn't need to help you? The question revealed how completely Marcus had hidden his true motivations from his daughter. Sophie still believed her father was acting out of love and concern, rather than greed and entitlement. Because he can't accept that he was wrong about me. He built his identity around being the responsible son taking care of his helpless mother. When he discovered I was never helpless, his entire self-image collapsed. Is that why he's been so angry and obsessed? Yes, sweetheart. And unfortunately, his anger is hurting the people who love him most. You and your mother. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Mom's been talking about taking me to stay with Aunt Rachel for a while. She says Dad needs space to work through his problems. The family was disintegrating under the pressure of Marcus's obsession, exactly as I'd feared. His campaign against me was destroying his marriage and traumatizing his daughter, but he couldn't see past his need to be right about my incompetence. Sophie, if you go stay with your aunt, I want you to know that you can always call me. No matter what your father says about me, no matter what stories he tells, you're always welcome in my life. Will I ever see you again? The question broke my heart. I hope so, sweetheart. But that depends on your father. As long as he's trying to hurt me, it's not safe for us to be in the same place. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching the evening fog roll in from the Pacific, thinking about the collateral damage of family conflicts. Sophie was an innocent victim of her father's inability to accept reality, but there was nothing I could do to protect her without endangering myself. The next morning brought a call from an unexpected source. Linda reached out through a mutual friend, asking if I would agree to speak with her privately. The restraining order technically prohibited direct contact, but it allowed for communication through third parties in emergency situations. Minnie, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand what's happening to Marcus. He's not sleeping, barely eating, spending every waking moment on plans to find legal ways to bring you home. It's like he's lost his mind. Linda, your husband tried to have me institutionalized so he could steal my money. That's not the behavior of someone who loves me. I know it looks that way, but you have to understand. Marcus genuinely believed you were struggling financially. He thought he was helping. The manipulation was subtle, but persistent. Linda was trying to reframe Marcus's actions as misguided love rather than calculated greed, as if good intentions could excuse attempted theft and imprisonment. Linda, even if Marcus believed I was poor, that didn't give him the right to make decisions about my life without my consent. He was planning to put me in a nursing home against my will. He was scared you'd get hurt living alone in that neighborhood. The crime rates, the isolation. He couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you. But he never asked what I wanted. He never considered that I might have other options or preferences. He just decided what was best for me and made plans accordingly. Linda was quiet for a moment. Minnie, he's my husband and Sophie's father. I'm watching him destroy himself over this, and I don't know how to help him. You help him by stopping enabling his behavior. Stop supporting his legal challenges. Stop funding his private investigators. Stop pretending this is about my welfare instead of his ego. I can't do that. He's my family. And I was his family, but that didn't stop him from trying to steal my freedom and my money. The conversation ended without resolution, but it confirmed what I'd suspected about Linda's role in the ongoing harassment. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She was an active participant who'd chosen to support Marcus's campaign regardless of its impact on me. Margaret called later that day with news that made Linda's call seem even more calculating. The Nevada lawyers have filed a motion asking for an emergency psychiatric evaluation based on your, quote, sudden personality changes and, quote, irrational financial decisions. They're arguing that wealthy, elderly people don't typically choose to live modestly, so your previous lifestyle proves you were already mentally impaired. The legal theory was breathtaking in its audacity and its complete misunderstanding of my situation. Marcus's lawyers were arguing that my choice to live frugally while secretly wealthy was evidence of mental illness, rather than evidence of a deliberate test of my family's character. Can they actually get a court to order an evaluation? Not in California, where you have extensive documentation of your competence. But they might be able to forum shop, looking for a jurisdiction that would be more sympathetic to their arguments. Forum shop? File the same petition in multiple states, hoping to find a judge who doesn't look too carefully at the evidence or who has preconceived notions about elderly people and money. This strategy represented a new level of legal harassment, designed to force me to defend my mental competence in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Even if I won every case, the time, expense, and emotional toll would be enormous. Margaret, I want to go on the offensive. No more just defending against Marcus's attacks. I want to file complaints against him. What kind of complaints? Elder abuse charges in Illinois. Harassment charges in California. Legal malpractice complaints against any lawyer who files frivolous petitions. I want to make sure there are real consequences for this behavior. Margaret was enthusiastic about the strategy. We have extensive documentation of Marcus's pattern of harassment and attempted financial exploitation. The restraining order establishes that a court has already found his behavior threatening. We're in a strong position to pursue criminal charges. The decision to fight back aggressively felt liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been playing defense, trying to protect myself from Marcus's attacks while hoping he'd eventually come to his senses. Now I was ready to make him face the legal consequences of his actions. The criminal complaint process began immediately. David Kim's security reports provided detailed documentation of the surveillance attempts. The financial records showed the enormous amounts Marcus was spending on his harassment campaign. The psychological evaluations proved that I was completely competent to make my own decisions. Most importantly, we had Marcus's own words from the original lawyers' meeting, where he'd explicitly discussed plans to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. The conversation had been recorded on the law firm's standard recording system, and it provided clear evidence of attempted financial exploitation. The Illinois State Attorney's Office assigned the case to prosecutor Sarah Chen, a specialist in elder abuse cases who'd built a reputation for holding family members accountable for exploitation. Her initial assessment was encouraging. Mrs. Butler, this is one of the clearest cases of attempted financial abuse I've seen. Your son's behavior shows premeditation, significant resources devoted to harassment, and a complete disregard for your autonomy and well-being. What kind of charges are we looking at? Attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, which is a felony in Illinois. Harassment across state lines, which could involve federal charges. Potentially conspiracy charges, if we can prove his wife and lawyers were knowing participants in the scheme. The prospect of serious criminal charges would finally force Marcus to confront the real-world consequences of his actions. He'd been operating under the assumption that family disputes were immune from legal accountability, but elder abuse laws were specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of behavior he'd been engaging in. While the criminal case developed, I focused on rebuilding my life around activities that brought me joy rather than obligation. The art classes had progressed to the point where I was painting landscapes that actually resembled their subjects. The volunteer work at the Literacy Center had expanded to include financial literacy classes for low-income seniors, teaching them how to protect themselves from exactly the kind of exploitation Marcus had attempted. Most satisfying was the philanthropic work I'd begun through the trust Margaret had established. Anonymous donations to domestic violence shelters, scholarships for first-generation college students, support for programs that helped elderly people maintain their independence. For the first time in my life, I had the resources to make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The contrast with my previous existence was striking. Instead of counting every dollar and justifying every purchase, I was able to respond generously to needs I encountered. The Literacy Center needed new computers. I bought them. A student in my financial literacy class needed help with medical bills. I arranged anonymous assistance. A domestic violence shelter needed funds for security upgrades. I provided them. The work gave my life a sense of purpose that went beyond personal satisfaction. I was using the wealth I'd accumulated to address real problems in the world, rather than hiding it out of fear that people would treat me differently if they knew about it. 6 weeks after filing the criminal complaint, prosecutor Sarah Chen called with significant news. Mrs. Butler, Marcus has been indicted by a grand jury on charges of attempted financial exploitation and interstate harassment. His lawyers have been notified, and he'll need to surrender himself for booking within the next 10 days. What does this mean practically? He'll be arrested, processed, and released on bail pending trial. But more importantly, he'll have to hire a defense attorney and face the possibility of significant prison time if he's convicted. How significant? Financial exploitation of an elderly person carries a potential sentence of 3 to 7 years in Illinois. The federal harassment charges could add additional time. The reality of criminal prosecution would finally force Marcus to confront the seriousness of his behavior. He'd been treating our conflict as a civil family dispute, but felony charges would make it clear that society viewed his actions as criminal rather than merely inappropriate. But I also knew that criminal charges might escalate his desperation rather than deterring further harassment. Men facing prison time sometimes made increasingly irrational decisions, and Marcus had already demonstrated a willingness to take extreme measures. David Kim shared my concerns about escalation. Mrs. Butler, we should expect that learning about the criminal charges will trigger a significant reaction from Marcus. People facing felony prosecution often engage in what we call extinction burst behavior, a final, desperate attempt to achieve their goals before the legal system stops them. What would that look like? Probably an attempt at direct confrontation, either with you personally or with the authorities handling his case. He might try to fly to California, might attempt to pressure the prosecutors to drop charges, might even consider more extreme measures. James Morrison, who'd been providing my personal security, agreed with David's assessment. The restraining order and criminal charges have backed him into a corner. Cornered people don't always make rational choices. Their warnings proved prophetic when Margaret called 3 days later with alarming news. Minnie, Marcus has withdrawn his entire retirement account and liquidated his stock portfolio. He's converted everything to cash, nearly $400,000. What would he need that much cash for? Nothing legal. That amount of liquid cash suggests he's planning something that can't be traced through normal financial channels. The cash withdrawal was perhaps the most ominous development yet. Marcus had already spent his family's savings on private investigators and lawyers, and now he was depleting his retirement funds for unknown purposes. The behavior suggested someone who'd moved beyond rational financial planning into desperation-driven decision-making. James immediately upgraded my security protocols, increasing surveillance around my building, and implementing new procedures for my daily activities. The threat level had escalated from harassment to potentially dangerous, and we needed to be prepared for any eventuality. Mrs. Butler, I strongly recommend that you consider temporary relocation while the criminal case proceeds. Marcus knows your current address, and having $400,000 in untraceable cash gives him significant resources for potentially dangerous activities. I'm not running from my own son. You're not running. You're taking reasonable precautions against someone who's demonstrated increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. The conversation forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. Marcus was no longer just an angry son trying to control his mother. He was a desperate man facing prison time, with substantial financial resources and a history of escalating harassment. The combination was genuinely dangerous. That evening, I called Sophie one final time before implementing the security measures that would make further contact impossible. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, and I could tell she'd been crying. "Grandma Minnie, Dad got arrested today. The police came to our house with handcuffs and everything. All the neighbors saw. I'm sorry you had to see that, sweetheart. Mom says you called the police on Dad. She says you're trying to send him to prison." The manipulation continued even in crisis, with Linda portraying me as the aggressor, rather than acknowledging Marcus's criminal behavior. But I couldn't correct Sophie's understanding without further traumatizing her. "Sophie, your father made some very serious mistakes, and now he has to face the consequences. This isn't about me wanting to hurt him. It's about protecting myself from someone who is trying to hurt me. Will he go to jail? I don't know. That depends on what choices he makes going forward. I don't understand why this is happening. Why can't you just come home and fix everything?" The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven this entire conflict. Sophie, like her father, believed that I had the power and responsibility to fix problems that weren't mine to solve. She wanted me to sacrifice my safety and autonomy to restore her family's stability. "Sweetheart, some things can't be fixed by giving up and letting other people have their way. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it makes other people angry." After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the beautiful things I'd finally allowed myself to own, thinking about the price of authenticity. Living honestly had cost me my relationship with my son and potentially my relationship with my granddaughter. But it had also given me something I'd never had before: the knowledge that I was valued for who I truly was rather than who I pretended to be. The next morning, James Morrison arrived early with news that confirmed our worst fears about Marcus's intentions. "Mrs. Butler, airport security in Chicago flagged your son attempting to board a flight to San Francisco with a large amount of cash and no return ticket. He was questioned but not detained, since carrying cash isn't illegal. So he's coming here. He's probably already here. The flight landed 2 hours ago." The moment I'd been dreading had finally arrived. Marcus was in San Francisco, armed with $400,000 in cash and whatever plan he'd been developing since learning about the criminal charges. All the security measures, legal protections, and careful precautions had led to this inevitable confrontation. What do we do now? We go to a safe location and let the authorities handle Marcus when he violates the restraining order. He can't reach you if he can't find you. I looked around my apartment one more time, at the life I'd built for myself in the months since walking away from Union Station. The art supplies scattered on the table, the books I'd been reading, the flowers I'd bought myself because I could afford them, and because they made me happy. "Let's go," I said. "It's time to finish this." The safe house was a modest apartment in the Richmond district, far from my usual neighborhood and completely off any radar Marcus might have developed. James had arranged it through his security network, and within 2 hours of learning about Marcus's arrival, I was installed there with Margaret and a rotating team of protection specialists. The waiting was the hardest part. I sat by the window watching fog roll through the Sunset District, while James coordinated with local police about Marcus's likely movements. The restraining order meant that any attempt to contact me or approach my building would result in immediate arrest, but we had to catch him in the act first. "Mrs. Butler," James said, hanging up from a call with his surveillance team, "Marcus checked into a hotel 6 blocks from your apartment building. He's using cash and a fake name, but our facial recognition software identified him at the front desk." "A fake name?" "He registered as Michael Brooks. It suggests he's aware that using his real identity would trigger alerts in our monitoring systems." The false identity represented a new level of premeditation and deception. Marcus wasn't acting impulsively. He was implementing a carefully planned strategy to circumvent the legal protections I'd established. Margaret had been quiet for most of the afternoon, reviewing documents on her laptop with the focused intensity she brought to complex legal problems. Now she looked up with the expression she wore when she'd identified a solution. "Minnie, I've been thinking about Marcus's cash withdrawal and his use of false identification. Those actions might constitute additional federal crimes, structuring financial transactions to avoid reporting requirements and identity fraud. What does that mean practically?" It means we can contact federal authorities about his activities here in California. The FBI takes interstate stalking very seriously, especially when it involves large amounts of cash and false identification. James nodded approvingly. Federal involvement would give us additional resources and would make it much harder for Marcus to disappear if he realizes the local police are looking for him. The afternoon stretched into evening with no direct contact from Marcus, but the surveillance teams reported increasingly erratic behavior. He'd walked past my building multiple times, had approached the doorman with questions about my daily routine, and had been seen photographing the exterior and noting security camera positions. He's doing reconnaissance, James explained, mapping the building's vulnerabilities and trying to identify patterns in your normal schedule. But I'm not there. He doesn't know that yet. He's probably planning to approach you when you leave for one of your regular activities: the art studio, the literacy center, the grocery store. The systematic surveillance was more sophisticated than I'd expected from someone having an emotional breakdown. Marcus was approaching this confrontation with the same methodical planning he'd once applied to business challenges, which made him more dangerous than a simply desperate person would be. Dr. Rodriguez called that evening with insights that helped explain Marcus's behavior. Minnie. People experiencing narcissistic collapse often develop elaborate fantasies about dramatic confrontations that will restore their sense of control and importance. He's probably convinced himself that if he can just talk to you face to face, he can make you understand his perspective and convince you to drop the charges. And if I don't respond the way he expects, that's when these situations become most dangerous. When reality doesn't match their fantasy script, people in Marcus's psychological state can become violent or engage in increasingly desperate behaviors. The psychological assessment confirmed what the security experts had been telling me. Marcus's carefully planned approach to finding me wasn't a sign of rational thinking, but rather evidence of how completely he'd disconnected from reality. That night, sleeping in an unfamiliar bed while protection specialists monitored the building's perimeter, I thought about how drastically my life had changed since that October evening at Union Station. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman pretending to be poor while secretly harboring vast wealth. Now I was a woman living authentically while hiding from a son who couldn't accept the truth about who I'd always been. The next morning brought the confrontation we'd been anticipating. James woke me at dawn with news that Marcus had been arrested outside my apartment building, carrying burglary tools and what appeared to be detailed plans of the building's layout. He was attempting to gain access to your apartment through a service entrance when building security spotted him. The police arrested him for violating the restraining order, attempted breaking and entering, and possession of burglary tools. Is he in jail? For now. But his lawyers will probably arrange bail within 24 hours, so this is likely just a temporary delay rather than a permanent solution. Margaret arrived an hour later with details about Marcus's arrest and the evidence police had recovered. Minnie, this goes far beyond simple harassment. Marcus had architectural plans of your building, schedules of your daily activities, and what appears to be a detailed plan for confronting you. She showed me photographs of the materials police had confiscated, handwritten notes about my routines, floor plans with my apartment highlighted, and a rambling letter addressed to me that outlined Marcus's grievances and his demands for reconciliation. What kind of demands? He wants you to return to Chicago immediately, submit to psychiatric evaluation by doctors of his choosing, and transfer control of your finances to him pending the results of that evaluation. The letter revealed the extent of Marcus's delusion. Even after criminal charges, restraining orders, and psychiatric evaluations proving my competence, he still believed he could force me to accept his version of reality. There's something else, Margaret continued. The letter includes threats about what will happen if you don't comply with his demands. He says he'll make sure Sophie never speaks to you again, that he'll pursue charges against me and David Kim for elder abuse, and that he'll expose your mental illness to the media. The threats were a mixture of emotional manipulation and legal intimidation, designed to make me feel isolated and vulnerable. But they also revealed how completely Marcus had misunderstood the situation. I was no longer the woman who could be controlled through guilt or fear. FBI agent Sarah Murphy contacted me later that morning to discuss the federal case they were building against Marcus. She was a veteran investigator with extensive experience in interstate stalking cases. and her assessment of Marcus's behavior was both professional and deeply concerning. Mrs. Butler, your son's activities meet the federal definition of interstate stalking, and his use of false identification and large cash transactions raise additional concerns about potential money laundering or structuring violations. What does this mean for the state charges in Illinois? The federal case will run parallel to the state prosecution. If he's convicted federally, he'll serve that sentence first, then face the state charges. We're looking at potentially 15 to 20 years total if he's convicted on all counts. The possibility of Marcus spending decades in prison was sobering, but Agent Murphy explained that his escalating behavior left prosecutors little choice about the severity of charges. Men like your son often view initial arrests as temporary setbacks rather than serious consequences. The only way to stop this pattern of behavior is through sentences long enough to force genuine reflection and change. That afternoon, I was finally able to return to my apartment under heavy security escort. The building felt different somehow, no longer the sanctuary it had been, but rather a place where my privacy had been violated and my safety threatened. Carlos, the doorman, approached me with obvious relief. Mrs. Butler, I'm so sorry about what happened. The man was very convincing when he said he was your nephew, and he seemed to know so much about your family. It's not your fault, Carlos. He's been planning this for months. The police said he had detailed information about when you usually leave for your art classes, when you go grocery shopping, even which elevator you prefer. How could he know all that? The question highlighted how thoroughly Marcus had invaded my life through surveillance and investigation. Every routine I'd established, every small pleasure I'd allowed myself, had been cataloged and analyzed as part of his plan to confront me. Margaret was already implementing additional security measures that would make future surveillance much more difficult. New building access protocols, varied daily routines, and counter-surveillance techniques that would detect any future monitoring attempts. The goal is to make sure this never happens again, she explained. Even if Marcus eventually gets out of prison, he won't be able to reconstruct the kind of detailed intelligence he had this time. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Linda. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words, and when she finally calmed down enough to speak clearly, her message was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Minnie, please, you have to drop the charges against Marcus. He's not a criminal. He's a sick man who needs help, not prison. Linda, your husband tried to break into my apartment with burglary tools. That's not the behavior of someone who's merely confused. He was desperate to talk to you. He thought if he could just explain his side, you'd understand that everything he did was out of love. The reframing was constant and exhausting. Every criminal act became evidence of love. Every violation of my boundaries became proof of Marcus's good intentions. Linda, love doesn't involve trying to steal someone's freedom and money. Love doesn't involve hiring private investigators to stalk them across the country. But you're his mother. Doesn't that count for something? It counted for 45 years while I raised him, supported him, and sacrificed for him. It stopped counting when he decided I was incompetent and disposable. Sophie is devastated. She doesn't understand why her grandmother won't forgive her father. There it was, the emotional manipulation I'd been expecting. Linda was using Sophie's pain as leverage to pressure me into dropping charges against a man who'd threatened my safety and autonomy. Linda, Sophie is devastated because her father chose to engage in criminal behavior rather than accepting that he was wrong about me. I'm not responsible for the consequences of Marcus's choices. So you're just going to let him go to prison? Let Sophie lose her father. I'm going to let the legal system hold Marcus accountable for his actions. If that means prison, then that's what his behavior has earned him. After hanging up, I realized that Linda's call represented the final attempt at emotional manipulation. With Marcus in jail and facing serious federal charges, the family was making a last desperate plea for me to sacrifice my safety for their convenience. But I was no longer the woman who could be guilted into accepting abuse for the sake of family harmony. I'd learned that real love didn't require me to enable destructive behavior or pretend that criminal actions were acceptable when motivated by family relationships. The next few weeks brought a parade of legal proceedings as Marcus's case moved through the federal system. His lawyers tried every possible defense: diminished capacity, family emergency, mental health crisis, but the evidence of premeditation and sophisticated planning undermined any claims that he'd acted impulsively or without understanding the consequences. Prosecutor Sarah Chen kept me informed about plea negotiations, though she made it clear that Marcus was unlikely to accept any deal that included significant prison time. He still believes he's the victim in this situation, she explained. His lawyers say he's convinced that a jury will understand he was just trying to help his confused mother. Will a jury see it that way? Not when they hear about the false identification, the burglary tools, and the detailed surveillance he conducted. This isn't the behavior of someone acting out of love. It's the behavior of someone planning a crime. The trial was scheduled for early spring, which gave me several months to continue rebuilding my life while Marcus remained in jail pending trial. The restraining order had been upgraded to a permanent injunction, and the federal charges meant that even if he were eventually released, he'd face decades of supervised probation with strict limitations on his ability to contact me. During this period, I finally felt safe enough to resume the activities that brought me joy. The art classes had progressed to advanced watercolor techniques, and I was painting landscapes that captured not just the visual beauty of San Francisco but the emotional freedom I'd discovered here. The Literacy Center had become a second home, where I worked with students who reminded me daily that transformation was possible at any age. Maria Santos had started her own small business with the confidence she'd gained from learning to read English fluently. Another student, James Williams, had earned his GED and was applying to community college programs. Mrs. Butler, Maria said one afternoon as we finished a lesson on business math, "You gave me more than reading skills. You gave me the belief that I could learn anything I wanted to learn. You already had that ability, Maria. I just helped you recognize it. My daughter says I'm a different person now. More confident, more willing to try new things." The conversation reminded me of my own transformation. Like Maria, I'd always had capabilities I hadn't fully recognized or utilized. The difference was that my growth had required unlearning the habit of minimizing myself for other people's comfort. The philanthropic work had expanded beyond individual donations to strategic investments in organizations that helped vulnerable populations maintain their independence. A program that provided legal services to elderly people facing financial exploitation. A scholarship fund for first-generation college students from immigrant families. Support for domestic violence shelters that helped women rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships. Each initiative represented a value I'd learned to prioritize: the importance of autonomy, the power of education, the necessity of having resources to escape dangerous situations. I was using my wealth to address systemic problems that trapped people in circumstances similar to what Marcus had tried to impose on me. Margaret had restructured my finances to support long-term philanthropic goals, while ensuring my own security for the rest of my life. The real estate portfolio continued generating steady income. The stock investments had grown substantially, and the trust structure protected everything from any future legal challenges. "Minnie, you're in a position where you could give away $10 million and still have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes," she explained during one of our quarterly financial reviews. "Good. I want to make sure that other people don't have to face what I faced, without resources to protect themselves." The decision to use my wealth for social impact rather than personal luxury felt like the natural evolution of the values that had guided my life. Money had never been the goal. Freedom and authenticity had been the goals, and money was simply the tool that made them possible. Spring brought the trial that would finally resolve the legal questions surrounding Marcus's behavior. I testified for 2 days, describing the progression from his initial plan to institutionalize me through his arrest outside my apartment building. The courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by the unusual nature of the case. A wealthy, elderly woman fighting back against her son's attempt to steal her autonomy. Legal reporters had dubbed it the reverse elder abuse case, highlighting how Marcus's actions represented the opposite of traditional family caregiving. Marcus's defense team tried to portray him as a loving son driven to desperate measures by concern for his mother's welfare. They argued that his surveillance and break-in attempt were misguided but well-intentioned efforts to help someone he believed was being manipulated by unscrupulous advisors. The prosecution systematically dismantled this narrative by presenting evidence of Marcus's methodical planning, his use of deception and false identification, and most damaging, Recordings from the original lawyers' meeting where he'd discussed having me declared incompetent for financial gain. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, prosecutor Sarah Chen argued in her closing statement, "This case isn't about family disagreements or misguided love. It's about a man who discovered his mother was wealthy and decided he deserved to control that wealth, regardless of her wishes or legal rights." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead as if he still couldn't accept that his actions had been judged criminal rather than loving. Judge Elizabeth Warren, who had presided over the trial with firm control and obvious familiarity with elder abuse cases, scheduled sentencing for the following month. She made it clear that she viewed Marcus's crimes as particularly serious because they involved betraying the trust inherent in family relationships. Mr. Butler, you exploited your position as your mother's son to gain access to personal information you then used to stalk and threaten her. This represents a profound violation of the bonds that should provide elderly people with security and support. The sentencing hearing brought representatives from several elder advocacy organizations who testified about the broader implications of Marcus's case. His conviction represented an important precedent for holding adult children accountable when they attempted to exploit elderly parents. Margaret had asked me whether I wanted to provide a victim impact statement, and after much consideration, I decided to speak directly to Marcus for the first time since the confrontation in Chicago. Your Honor, I want Marcus to understand that his actions didn't just hurt me legally or financially. They destroyed my ability to trust the people closest to me. He taught me that the son I raised and loved saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. I looked directly at Marcus as I continued. I gave you everything I had to give for 45 years. I worked multiple jobs to put you through college, went without so you could have opportunities, and supported your family even when I thought I couldn't afford it. In return, you tried to steal my freedom and my dignity. Marcus finally met my eyes, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the boy I'd once known, the child who'd cried when he accidentally broke one of my few nice dishes. But the moment passed, and his expression hardened back into the resentful mask he'd worn throughout the trial. I hope you use your time in prison to understand why your actions were wrong, not just legally but morally. I hope you learn that love doesn't give you the right to control other people's lives. Judge Warren sentenced Marcus to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The sentence was longer than his lawyers had hoped, but shorter than the maximum penalty he could have received. Mr. Butler, your crimes represent a calculated campaign to deprive your mother of her fundamental rights to autonomy and self-determination. The sophisticated planning and cross-state execution of your harassment campaign require a substantial period of incarceration to protect potential future victims, and to deter similar crimes by others. Walking out of the courthouse after sentencing, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the legal ordeal was finally over. Sadness that my relationship with Marcus had ended in a courtroom rather than reconciliation. But also a deep sense of satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself and established consequences for behavior that could have destroyed my life. The media coverage of the case had sparked broader conversations about elder abuse and the importance of financial autonomy for elderly people. Several states had strengthened their laws protecting elderly adults from exploitation by family members. Using Marcus's case as an example of sophisticated financial predators who hid behind relationships of trust, Sophie called me that evening, her voice subdued but clearer than it had been in months. Grandma Minnie, I watched the news coverage of Dad's sentencing. I think I finally understand what really happened. What do you understand, sweetheart? That Dad wasn't trying to help you, he was trying to control you, and that you fought back because you had to, not because you wanted to hurt him. That's exactly right. I'm sorry I believed the things Mom said about you being confused or manipulated. I should have known you better than that. Sophie, you were protecting your father because you love him. That's not something you should apologize for. Can I come visit you sometime? I'm 18 now, so Mom can't stop me. The possibility of rebuilding a relationship with Sophie felt like the first genuinely positive outcome of this entire ordeal. She was old enough to understand the complexity of the situation, and to make her own decisions about family relationships. I would love that. Anytime you want to come to San Francisco, you're welcome here. I start college in the fall at UC Berkeley. Maybe I could visit on weekends sometimes. Sophie, Berkeley is just across the bay. You could visit as often as you want. The conversation gave me hope that something valuable could be salvaged from the wreckage of my relationship with Marcus. Sophie was an intelligent, thoughtful young woman who deserved to know her grandmother without the filter of her parents' manipulation and deception. Over the following months, as the media attention died down and the legal proceedings became a closed chapter, I continued building the life I'd discovered in San Francisco. The apartment felt like home again, now that the security threats had been eliminated. The art studio became a place where I could express emotions I'd never had vocabulary for. The literacy center remained a source of purpose and connection. Most importantly, I'd learned to live without apology for who I was or what I'd accomplished. The woman who'd hidden her wealth out of fear that people would treat her differently had been replaced by someone who used her resources openly and strategically to make positive changes in the world. Sophie's first visit came in September, just after she'd started classes at Berkeley. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, carrying a small overnight bag, and the kind of nervous excitement that comes with venturing into unknown territory. "Grandma, this place is amazing," she said, walking through my apartment and stopping at the windows overlooking the bay. "I had no idea you lived somewhere this beautiful. I had no idea I could live somewhere this beautiful, until I finally stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't." We spent the weekend exploring the city, visiting museums and galleries, walking through neighborhoods where artists and writers had created communities around shared creative goals. Sophie was fascinated by the stories of people who'd reinvented themselves in San Francisco, who'd left conventional lives behind to pursue dreams that seemed impossible elsewhere. "Is that what you did, Grandma? Reinvented yourself?" "I think I finally became myself. The person I'd always been underneath the roles I played for other people." "Do you miss Dad at all?" "I miss the person I thought he was. I miss believing that he loved me unconditionally. But I don't miss being treated as a burden or an obstacle to be managed." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Mom's been talking about divorce. She says she can't trust Dad anymore after everything that happened. How do you feel about that?" "Relieved, honestly. The house has been so tense and angry for so long. Maybe, if they separate, they can both figure out how to be better people." The maturity in her response reminded me that teenagers often understood family dynamics more clearly than the adults who tried to protect them from difficult truths. On Sunday morning, before Sophie returned to Berkeley, we sat on my balcony drinking coffee and watching sailboats navigate the bay. The fog was lifting, revealing the Oakland Hills in sharp detail against a clear blue sky. "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you think Dad will ever understand why you did what you did? Why you had to fight back?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Understanding would require him to admit that he was wrong about some very fundamental things, and that's psychologically difficult for people like your father." "People like Dad?" "People who build their identity around being needed and important. When that identity gets challenged, they sometimes double down rather than accepting new information." "But there's a chance he could change?" "There's always a chance. 12 years is a long time to think about choices and consequences, but I can't base my life on hoping for changes that may never come." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, watching the sailboats and processing what I'd said. "I think you're the strongest person I know." "I'm not strong, sweetheart. I just finally learned that I deserved to be treated with respect, and I was willing to fight for that respect when it wasn't given freely." As I drove Sophie back to Berkeley that afternoon, I thought about the different kinds of family we can create throughout our lives. The biological family that shapes us in childhood doesn't have to define our entire existence. Sometimes the family we choose, through friendship, shared values, and mutual respect, becomes more meaningful than the family we inherit. My relationship with Sophie represented the possibility of maintaining valuable connections while still protecting my boundaries and autonomy. She could love her father while also understanding that his behavior toward me had been unacceptable. She could maintain a relationship with me without being forced to choose sides in an adult conflict. The balance felt sustainable in a way that my previous family relationships never had. I was no longer responsible for managing other people's emotions or sacrificing my well-being for their comfort. I could offer love and support without enabling destructive behavior or accepting abuse in return. As winter returned to San Francisco, bringing with it the season of reflection and gratitude, I found myself thinking often about the journey that had brought me to this place. The woman who'd been abandoned at Union Station with $20 seemed like someone from a different lifetime, though less than a year had passed since that October evening. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. I'd lost relationships I'd valued and faced threats I'd never imagined possible from someone I'd loved unconditionally. But I'd also discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and built a life that reflected my authentic values and priorities. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, even when that choice disappoints people who've grown comfortable with your sacrifices. The courage to live authentically doesn't decrease with age. Sometimes it takes decades of experience to fully understand what authentic living actually requires. I was Minnie Butler, 73 years old, worth $47 million, and finally, completely, triumphantly free to be exactly who I'd always been underneath the masks I'd worn for others' comfort. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.